Morning. How's everyone doing today? Well, good. Hey, so we are going to be continuing on in our series today, looking at Lamentations, a series called Ruins. For those of you who are new or weren't here last week, we're doing something very different than what we normally do on a normal Sunday morning at the sermon time. So rather than a 30 to 45-minute monologue from me where you're hearing information and you're being taught stuff, this time is more about us experiencing something together. And that's what this whole sermon series is about. So if you're new here or you don't like this, don't worry. We'll be back to our normal routine doing things come February, so you can just come back then if you need to wait. But we're going to be talking about grief, and we're going to be framing this in the way that Hebrew poetry is framed and how it's structured. But there's more to that later on. But we're going to be starting off with a corporate act of prayer. Now, this is different than when you meet together with friends and you have a prayer gathering in a church. If your experience was like mine when I grew up, you were in a church gathering and a prayer meeting, and it'd be an hour long, and the first 45 minutes is all of like people just basically gossiping, and then you do 15 minutes of prayer, and there's one person who just prays on and on and on forever, and everyone falls asleep, right? But this is different. This is a corporate experience where we're all invited to be part of, where there's going to be a prompt up on the screen, if you guys wouldn't mind throwing it up on the screen now so they can see that. And the way this is going to be structured is that anyone in the room is welcome to come up to one of the mics and say the opening prompt of 4 and then one sentence, short one sentence. We're going to cut you off if it's more than that, right? Of just something that you are thankful for, and end it with the phrase, loving God, which tells the rest of the congregation to say, we give you thanks. Now, here's why we do this. This is a beautiful practice in the church of reminding us that your prayer is not just your prayer, it's our prayer. That faith is not just your relationship with Jesus, it's our relationship with Jesus. That what burdens you burdens us. What is a joy to you is a joy to all of us. Because Christ has given us enough grace that in our sorrow we can enter into the joy of others, and in our joy we can still step into the sorrow of others. That's the beauty of the grace that God gives us in a community that is bringing these things, all things, back to Jesus. And so right now we're gonna open up our sermon time by doing this. I know this is gonna be weird, but there's gonna be a microphone up here, and there's gonna be a microphone up there. And if there's something you're like, hey, I just want to express some gratitude and some thanksgiving, let's do it now. Because the rest of the sermon, we're going to be talking about grief. Right? So let's start it off with maybe some thanksgiving. And so I'll do the first one, and you feel free, come up to one of the microphones. There's one upstairs for you guys in the balcony. I know you're introverts and you hide up there, but you can still join us in this moment. If you're watching online, feel free to join us as well on the live stream with commenting. We had a lot of people do that last week. It was really cool to see. But let me go ahead and start us off, and feel free to come up to the microphone just to express something that you're thankful for. So here's an easy one. I'll steal this for all of us. For the snow days this week, loving God, we give you thanks.
For the Bluff Church and our pastors, loving God, thanks.
For my wonderful family, loving God,
Thanks. The ways that you are working amongst this community, loving God, we give you thanks.
For opening my eyes to truth, loving God.
Thanks.
for Jesus Christ, loving God,
we give you thanks. For the purpose that you give us, loving God, we give you thanks. The laughter of newborn babies, loving God, Give you thanks. For the ways you're with us every day, loving God.
From one of our online folks, for the grace and mercy of God, loving God.
We give you thanks. For what you have ahead of us this year, loving God. We give you thanks.
For second, third, and 400th chances, loving God.
We give you thanks. Won't you pray with me now? Father, thank you for who you are. And thank you for what you're going to do this morning as we look at your word and we see the beauty of it and how it speaks to our souls. I'm praying that right now, with all that we have brought into this space, all the good and the bad, that it is handed over to you so that we are free to hear what you have to say, and we might walk out of here saying, man, how great is our God. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So here's a reality that we all face, and that's that we all experience loss. And it comes in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's the loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's loss of a dream, loss of a goal. But because we all experience loss, we also all experience grief. But we don't always grieve well. Sometimes when we grieve, and this is probably more oftentimes when we grieve, we don't want to actually deal with it. So we bury it down, we ignore it, we try to distract ourselves, we try to numb the pain, we do whatever we can to avoid having to address the problem. Because it's painful. Because we don't like to grieve. Especially as Westerners, we want to do everything by ourselves, we want to be independent. And yet this is not a healthy way of dealing with things. Because pain that is not addressed always leaks out. And so when we don't learn to grieve well, it leaks out into bitterness and cynicism, passive aggressiveness, the snide and snarky comments to others. These things come about usually because we have failed to grieve over something in our past. But God is so gracious, and this is what we're seeing in Lamentations, is He is inviting us to grieve, and He's inviting us to have space to process these emotions and to deal with them. Because as Westerners, while we might want to deal with them by ourselves in isolation and just accept the loneliness and the depression and all that comes with that, God invites us into community. And He invites us to express these emotions publicly and with one another so that we might get through them. Because sometimes, in order for God to break us into who we need to be, He needs to first break us down. And this is a unique aspect to grieving, especially when guilt is associated. Guilt and grief are oftentimes very closely associated. Sometimes it's guilt over what has not happened, right? Where we're like, gosh, I wish I had done this. And sometimes it's guilt over what has happened, where we carry regrets. And we sit there and think, I wish I had not done this thing. Guilt and grief are oftentimes very closely associated with one another. They're part of the journey. Sometimes they're guilt that's misplaced. Like you're guilty, you feel guilty over not having done enough or not doing this thing over here, and that's just unrealistic. But sometimes it's good to actually face the real guilt and have that slice of humble pie and be able to look at me like, I messed up. I did something wrong. And now this devastation, this desolation around me is because of me. And that's a hard thing because we like to avoid that guilt. We don't want to face it. Yet God in His Word is so gracious to us because He helps us process through this. And Lamentations chapter 2 that we're going to be looking at today is all about that. Now let me give you a little bit of history and context. Lamentations is coming after the desolation of the destruction of Jerusalem, when Babylon marched in 586 BCE, and they just destroyed Jerusalem. Now, this was something long promised. It did not have to happen, but God had promised it long ago when the nation of Israel was first formed. So the guy who led the nation at the time was a guy named Moses. And he says in his closing remarks, he basically gives this big speech. It's called Deuteronomy. It was basically the constitution of the people of his day. And he warned them that one day, if they continue in the way that they are going, Babylon was going to come and knock them out. Here, listen to these words, all right? So it's recorded to us in Deuteronomy chapter 28. This is hundreds of years before Babylon was actually became a nation, right? They weren't even on the planet. And yet, this is what Moses points out. He says, all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you till you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that he commanded. And they shall be a sign and a wonder against you and your offspring forever, because you did not serve Yahweh your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things. Basically, these guys, these people he's talking to, he's like, man, if you go chasing after the same things that everyone else is chasing after, which we can summarize it as sex, money, and power. It's like, if you continue chasing after these things like everyone else, rather than chasing after what God has for you, it's going to be bad. And here's what he says happens. He says, therefore, you shall serve your enemies, whom Yahweh will send against you, in hunger and thirst and nakedness and lacking everything, and he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. Yahweh will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. And so for centuries, prophets kept coming up who kept warning God's people, saying, guys, if we continue down this track, this is going to happen to us. But people didn't want to listen. They didn't care. They're like, well, we're good enough. We've got our temple. We've got God's law. We've got his word. We can just read it whenever we want. And look, it says that God is so faithful and so loving. He will never allow anything bad to ever happen to us. And so they would not rethink what they were doing and change their ways. They could not face their guilt. Until finally, God allows to happen what he had been holding off for so long. And they found their desolation, they found their destruction when Babylon came in and spanked the tar out of them. And Lamentations is written right after that, of a people grieving when they have to look at themselves in the mirror and see what they've become. And so we're going to have a reading of it today. And today it's going to be from Caden Luke, from the first reading. He's going to be coming up. And while he comes up, I want to encourage you to do something. This is sacred text that we're hearing. We don't have a whole lot of sacred things in our world, but this is something sacred that God has given us, and it's good to prepare your own heart for it. So I want you, as he's coming up, maybe take a few deep breaths. Maybe you need to follow along either on the screen or with your own Bible. Maybe you need to put yourself in a comfortable posture, maybe put your hands out or something like that to feel like you're receiving this. But this is something I want you to hear very carefully, and I want you to hear the way that the audience is seeing themselves for who they have become. So, Caden, whenever you're ready.
A reading from Lamentations chapter 2. How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up without mercy all the habitations of Jacob. In his wrath he has broken down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. He has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn from them his right hand in the face of the enemy. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consuming all around. He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe. He has killed all who were delightful in our eyes, in the tent of the daughter of Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has laid in ruins its strongholds. He has multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentations. He has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. Yahweh has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath. In his first indignation, his spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned and his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They raised a clamor in the house of Yahweh, as on the day of festival. Yahweh determined to lay in ruins the wall of the daughter of Zion. He stretched out the measuring line. He did not restrain his hand from destroying. He caused rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. Her king and princes are among the nations. The law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from Yahweh. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent on weeping, my stomach churns. The bile is poured out to the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, because infants and babies faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, where is bread and wine? As they faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city. As their life is poured out on the mother's bosom, what can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken to you, that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? For your ruin is vast as the sea. Who can heal you? Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen for you oracles that are false and misleading. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all the earth? All your enemies rail against you. They hiss, they gnash their teeth, they cry. We have swallowed her. Ah, this is the day we longed for. Now we have it, we see it. Yahweh has done what he proposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He has thrown down pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you, and exalted the might of your foes. Their heart cried to the Lord, O wall of the daughter of Zion. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to them, for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Yahweh, and see, with whom you have dealt this. Should women eat the fruit of their womb? Should the children of their tender care? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of Yahweh? In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. You summoned, as if to a festival day, my pairs on every side. And on the day of the anger of Yahweh, no one escaped or survived. Those who I am held and raised, my enemy destroyed.
The word of the Lord. Praise be to God. You know, we oftentimes try to avoid guilt by any means, don't we? Like when someone points out that we've done something wrong, well, we retaliate by pointing out what they've done wrong. When a spouse gets caught saying, hey, they're looking at pornography, well, they might retaliate and say, well, I wasn't having an affair. Or like at drunkenness, well, at least I'm not beating someone. Oh, shopaholic, well, at least I'm not gambling. We find ways to turn things around to make ourselves feel like we're not as guilty as what we actually are. Because we don't want to face the truth. We're all guilty of something. We've all crossed the boundary. We've all crossed the line. We've all accepted things that weren't true. And we've done things that we ought to regret. But we do everything we can to avoid hearing that. And do everything we can to avoid having to face it. And so sometimes we put distractions in our lives. We numb ourselves. We put anything up in front of us to tell ourselves a different message than what actually may be true. This was the problem that the Israelites had got into for a long time. God was sending prophets saying, guys, we got to stop this. Guys, we got to turn this around. Yeah, we've got the temple. Yeah, we've got God's law, but no one's following it. No one's doing what it's saying, but we're just saying we're good because of who we are, because of our story and things like that, because we go to the right places. But meanwhile, the people, they were just pursuing the same things as everyone else, the sex, money, and power, even to the point that history says that they started doing child sacrifices just to get more of those things. If I sacrifice my kid, I'll have a better job and a better future for my life. And that's the world that they came to. But they built this whole thing with putting people in charge and people who would speak for them, who would absolve them of the guilt without having to face it. Jeremiah points that out in verse 14. He says, "Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen for you oracles that are false and misleading." He's like, look, you guys, you surrounded yourself with all these messages all around you that would tell you you're good. You didn't do that bad of a thing. And we like that. We all do that. It's human nature. It doesn't mean it's always the truth. And that's what he's pointing out. He's like, he's been chasing after something that wasn't true. And it's human nature. But eventually God had to keep his promises. And what he said was, if you keep going down this route, if you keep leading towards your own destruction, that's what will meet you. And so we read in verse 17, where it says, "Yahweh has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He has thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes." The God we worship and follow is a promise keeper. But we may not like the promises he keeps. And he made this promise long ago. And now the people had to face God's anger and wrath. Now, that's not a topic we like to talk about. We like the messages of God's love and grace and forgiveness, and that's all good, and that's all true. But God's justice, his righteousness, his anger, his wrath, well, those are things we don't like to hear. But God's wrath is always in the context of allowing us to eventually receive the very thing that we've been asking for all along. But his wrath is always long-suffering. Because if you follow the story of God, right, it's easy to just jump to certain passages and be like, look, this is an angry, vindictive God. But if you follow the story of God, God for centuries kept telling his people, trying to win their hearts back. He's long-suffering, but eventually he has a breaking point. And so that's what happened. Eventually he got to a breaking point. He's like, man, if I'm going to break through to you, then you got to break down. And sometimes that happens in our own lives as well. Where God is so incredibly long-suffering. But sometimes to get our attention, he lets us face the very thing that we've been asking for all along. The very thing that he's been keeping back from us. The very thing he's been trying to save us from. Until a point where we have to look at him and be like, I got what I deserved and I was guilty. And we've all been there. And yet in this state, as Jeremiah is voicing for people who are voicing the realization that they are deserving of the very devastation that they've seen, which is really hard to wrestle and swallow and accept when you've seen what has happened. And yet he's still voicing, he's like, we got what we deserved. He still in this moment has hope that God would hear his plea for mercy. And so he voices that in verse 18 and 19. This is important to recognize. He says, their heart cried to Yahweh, O wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of Yahweh. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children. who faint for hunger at the head of every street. See, this is the amazing twist, is that God will sometimes present us as guilty. It's like, you are guilty, and yet he still gives us space to cry out for his mercy. Where he doesn't say, I won't hear you. No. And that's what's happening in this moment. They're facing their guilt, but they're also facing the reality that God still hears their prayers and their cries for mercy. And they have confidence that he could still intervene and change things. That while they are getting what they deserved, for the consequences of their actions, they still have the space to find God gracious and good in this space. And so this teaches us something very valuable, something worth noting and reflecting on. It's that if guilt does not lead to cries for mercy, it will lead to cries of desolation. The first half of the poem is cries of desolation because after years and years of facing their guilt, they were not crying out for mercy. They thought, man, I've got a little bit more time. Or I'm not as bad as someone else. Or I'm good because I did these things, and so therefore I'm good with God. But they never stopped and said, God, I need you right now because I know without you I'm a mess. If our guilt does not lead to cries for mercy, it will lead to cries of desolation. And that's kind of what Jeremiah is putting. He's like, guys, for those who are future readers, don't make the same mistake we did for centuries. Stop and recognize how good God is. How quick he is to show mercy when our cry for mercy is truly sincere. Not, oh yeah, God, have mercy on me. But no, recognizing, oh God, I need your mercy today. And so as we listen to the second reading now, this one's going to be coming from Kira Willis. I want you to really be paying attention to the last half of the poem. Where after they've seen their guilt and recognized their guilt, the last half of their poem is the cry for mercy. So Kira, if you would, please.
A reading from Lamentations chapter 2. How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up without mercy all the habitations of Jacob. In his wrath he has broken down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. He has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn from them his right hand in the face of the enemy. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consuming all around. He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe, and he has killed all who were delightful in our eyes in the tent of the daughter of Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has laid in ruins its strongholds, and he has multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. He has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. Yahweh has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath, and in his fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They raised a clamor in the house of Yahweh as on the day of festival. Yahweh determined to lay in ruins the wall of the daughter of Zion. He has stretched out the measuring line. He did not restrain his hand from destroying. He caused rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. Her king and princes are among the nations. The law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from Yahweh. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out to the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, because infants and babies faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" as they faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out of their mother's bosom. What can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken to you that I may comfort you, O daughter of Zion? For your ruin is vast as the sea. Who can heal you? Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore for your fortunes. You have seen for your oracles that are false and misleading. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all the earth? All your enemies rail against you. They hiss, they gnash their teeth. They cry, we have swallowed her. Ah, this is the day we longed for. Now we have it, we see it. Yahweh has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He has thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes. Their hearts cried out to the Lord, O wall of the daughter of Zion. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Yahweh, and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. You have summoned to a festival day my terrors on every side. On the day of the anger of Yahweh, no one escaped or survived. Those whom I held and raised, my enemy destroyed. The word of the Lord.
Praise be to God. As much as we don't want to address our guilt, as much as we wish to ignore it, forget about it, move on, it's good that we remember it. Because in our remembrance, it reminds us of our great need for God and for his mercy, his kindness. For we are saved by his loving kindness. And we are reminded day after day of his long suffering, how patient he is. When we forget that, we invite a lot of trouble. When we forget that, we become prideful and arrogant. And we fall into a pattern that will only lead to our own desolation. Jesus called this out in his own context, with his own religious, good, church-going people. When he said this, it's recorded in the biography known as the Gospel of Matthew, where he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, 'Oh, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets.'" Basically saying, "Oh, if we lived in those days, we would never have made the same mistakes." But Jesus gives this. He says, "Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets." I mean, those are rather harsh words to hear. And yet, Jesus tells a story about how we should respond to God and how we should respond to when we face guilt, rather than trying to deflect and rather than try to redirect it, rather than try to absolve it or minimize it. He gives us a story of how God actually wants us to respond to him. And it's a beautiful story. So the story goes that two men came to the temple, the holiest place on the planet, to meet with God. And one of them was a religious elite Pharisee, a guy who knew all the scriptures backwards and forwards, who was a great man, who did all these wonderful service on the behalf of God. And the other one was a tax collector, a man who spent his entire life stealing from his own people to benefit a Roman Empire that was oppressing his people. Both of them walk in side by side into the temple. The first man, the Pharisee, stops, he looks around, and he gives this prayer. It's recorded for us in Luke chapter 18. He says, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." You know, that's not a very uncommon prayer. We stop and say, "God, thank you so much that I'm not like this person," or "Thank you so much that I don't have these struggles in my life, that I'm better than that I don't have these addictions, I don't have these vices, I don't have these temptations in my life. God, thank you so much that I haven't blown up my life like that person over there." This is so easy for us to pray like this. But then the second man prays. And Jesus says, this guy says this, according to verse 13. He says, "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Two distinctly different people when they come into the presence of God. One's like, oh, God, thank you that you've made me. And the other one's just begging, God, please have mercy on me. And here's what the response that happens, that Jesus says in verse 14. It says, I tell you, this man, referring to the second man, went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The reality of our guilt does not diminish our position to still plead for the mercy of God, to know that He hears us, to know that He is always ready right there to change the story. Sometimes what's needed is our own sincerity after we've seen how desperately we need God. And we've given up trying to control things. We've given up trying to manipulate things. We've given up trying to get things our way. We've stopped and pleaded, God, please have your way with my life. So we're going to wrap up this sermon the same way we wrapped up last week with another corporate prayer. This one is about asking for petition and mercy of God. And so it's going to work the same way. There's going to be a prompt up on the screen. I'm going to encourage you guys to read it, and you can come up to one of the microphones. After this, I will close us out in a prayer, and then we're going to take communion when the band comes up. And I'm encouraging you guys to, when you take communion, take it when you're ready. Don't feel like you have to rush to come up to the stand. But maybe for some of you in this room, what you need to do is there's something on your heart that you need to give to Jesus. Maybe you need to release something. Maybe you need to invite Jesus into something. Maybe you just need to just express, God, this is what I'm grieving over, and I'm giving it to you. So this is why we have those little index cards on your seats. And we're encouraging you. This is not everyone. You don't have to do this. This is not forced upon you. But if you feel like you need to do something like this, we're encouraging you to write something down and then just throw it at the cross before you take communion. As a way of saying, God, I'm giving this to you so that my hands are free to take the life that you have for me, to take the joy that you have for me, to take the purpose you have for me, to take Jesus. So that may be what you need to do. But before we do that, we're going to do this corporate prayer. And I invite you to come up to one of the microphones, either to this one or to the one up there, or for those of you watching online, feel free to do the same thing again. And there's no judgment here on anything you feel like you need to say. There's no backstory you have to give. This is just about expressing God. We're asking that you would please meet us here. And what's beautiful about this is something that you raise up is all that we share. And something that you raise up is what we share, and what you raise up is what we share together, petitioning God. And so let me start us off right now, and then feel free to come to the mic whenever you're ready. For Henry Osborne, merciful God, hear our prayer.
For people going through things that they feel they can't or should not talk about, merciful God,
Hear our prayer. For those struggling with sickness right now, merciful God.
For your love, grace, and mercy that we don't deserve, merciful God.
Hear our prayer. For those sins we refuse to let go of, merciful God. Hear our prayer.
For those fighting anxiety, depression, and all mental illnesses, merciful God.
Hear our prayer.
For marriages in and outside of the church, merciful God.
Hear our prayer. For those who have lost their homes in the wildfires, merciful God. For those fighting with loneliness, merciful God.
For the people who don't know Jesus, merciful God.
Hear our prayer.
For our peacekeepers here at home and around the world, hear, merciful God.
Hear our prayer. For those who work in education, merciful God. For those who long to be near family but can't, merciful God. For those fighting battles unseen and unspoken, merciful God. And for those walking the road of grief right now, merciful God. Won't you pray with me now? O Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us sinners. We are more prone to be like the first man than to be like the second. And oftentimes we try to do things our own way without you involved, and we don't want to listen to you, even though when you're pleading with us over and over again to turn around. We try to control things, we try to manipulate things, we try to get things our way. We walk over others, we don't care. Father, forgive us because our hearts are so hard and we oftentimes lead to our own desolation and destruction. Please open our eyes to see you, and in that to also see ourselves. But also open our eyes to see how good your grace and your mercy is. Help us see the righteousness of Christ, that in the place of our sin, you offer forgiveness and mercy and grace by the blood of Jesus Christ. Thank you for that. And thank you for this lesson, because this shows us that we don't have to go down the same path that our faith ancestors went. That these words were preserved for us, not only to show us that we can voice some really hard feelings towards you about our situations, but also to see that you still hear our prayer and our cry for mercy. Father, I know that there are many who possibly in this room, who when they mess up, they feel like, oh, you've rejected them, you've turned away from them, you don't want anything to do with them. But that's not what we're seeing in this chapter. We're seeing that in the face of that space, you are still attentive and still longing to hear us ask for your mercy and involvement. So, Father, with the things that people are in this room are carrying, voiced and unvoiced, I'm asking that your mercy might be displayed and seen, and that it might live in us and through us and be shared outside of us for those around us. So as we sing right now, may we see you and all the glory that is of you. It's in your name I pray. Amen. When you're ready, come take communion at one of the stations around the room.